Everybody, welcome to what is for us the last episode of 2023, and for you all will be the first episode of 2024. We're looking back at a year in review on CO2, and who better to join us than Rich Gottwald, CEO of the Compressed Gas Association, and Rob Cockerill, Content Director for Gasworld. And both of these gentlemen have been very busy over the past year. Jeff, we listened to you actually at the CO2 Summit put on by Gasworld back in 22, saying this year was painful. 23, we don't feel there will be as much pain, but it will come back. It will rear its head, and maybe that's what we talk about today. Quick year in review. A lot of buzz around the pipelines, and there has been so much shift there. Rich, you guys started the CO2 Coalition trying to get end users involved. We had the CO2 Summit in Indy in September and one coming up in Austria to start 2024. So an exciting time, maybe not as much pain, Jeff. We didn't feel some of the tensions that we did in 22, but the buzz was there and it sets the stage for 2024. So everybody, welcome to the podcast. Excited to have you all.
Absolutely. Let's maybe let these fine gentlemen introduce themselves. I'm sure most everybody listening and watching probably already knows both of them. But Rich, Rob, please just introduce yourselves and your associations and your outlets, and we'll go from there.
I'm Rich Gottwald, and I'm President and CEO of the Compressed Gas Association. CGA is the trade association for all things compressed gases. We're going to talk about CO2, but our members also provide products like helium, hydrogen, argon, oxygen, medical oxygen, all those sorts of products. I think we cover 55 different gases within our membership. We're based here. We're talking to you from McLean, Virginia, and happy to be here with y'all today.
Hi, and Rob Cockerill here, Content Director for Gasworld, as we heard. Gasworld's the leading global media and events provider for the industrial gases business. So everything from magazines to online newsletters, events, summits, webinars, soon podcasts, we think. So all kind of different media for this space. And when we talk about this space, we're talking about helium, hydrogen, CO2, a whole range of gases. So there's a lot to keep us busy.
Yeah, no, it's great to have both of you, and we've got the broad reach of the entire gas association of all the producers and users of the gases, but also the media outlets that are keeping us updated and basically in touch and fingers on the pulse of the entire industry. And what we hope and we strive for here, and I know both of you do as well. How do we get more end users involved? So everybody knows about CO2, but do they really understand the backside of the industry and the impact that everything that happened in the last couple of years is having on them? They know they don't have CO2 when they run out. They know the price has gone up, and they've heard little bits about allocations or force majeures or whatever it is, but do they understand why? And so we try to educate that end use base, and I know you do as well. We really think this is a great opportunity to kind of really further expand that message. I mean, I know between your organizations, you have tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people reach, basically. So great to have you. And as Luke noted, I mean, we in 2022 at the CO2 Gas World Summit, we kind of presented and talked about the world's changing. Where you get your CO2 from, who you get it from, and the price you pay for it, they're all going to change. But it wasn't really going to be this year. And what we hope is people haven't forgotten about it. The pain, the wounds have cauterized some, and the pain went away some, but it's coming, and it still is. But how much farther out are we? So I'll let both of you guys talk about pipelines were going to be the big thing. That was all the talk in 2022, and then 2023, and then 3/4 of the way through the year. Pipelines we kind of are now forgotten about because they've been mothballed to some extent. Summit's still online, Wolf's still online, but the big one, the Navigator, is kind of mothballed at the moment. So what are you guys seeing? What are you hearing? What's going on in the world of pipelines?
Well, Jeff, I think, from CGA's perspective, maybe to set the stage of what we're seeing out there, pipelines play into it. But anyone listening to this podcast knows that every year, most years, there's always these shortages of CO2 come along, and it gets into things like allocations, as you were mentioning. But what we've seen over the past couple of years, and we'll continue to see in the future, is that the very landscape around CO2 is changing. Because as global warming becomes more of a dominant issue of our time, and we've just seen that through the COP28 hearings of meetings over the past couple of weeks, CO2 is the number one gas leading to global warming. Industrial emissions of CO2 is a real challenge. And so the whole world is looking at CO2 and how do we eliminate CO2 from the environment to kind of play down and to control global warming. But we all know that CO2 has a really critical role to many applications in society. And so as we've been trying to, let's say, uh, build a reliable supply of CO2 for all these applications over here, the rest of the world is saying, no, we need to get rid of CO2 to limit global warming. So what we've been focused on this year, and by the way, the pipelines play into that, because suddenly CO2 is a valuable commodity, and there's tax credits being given out to take that CO2 and sequester it. What we realize is that people don't understand how CO2 is used. When I say people, I mean the general public, but also policymakers who are putting these policies into place. So we've embarked on a project this year, and we called this the CO2 Solutions Coalition, where we're bringing the providers of CO2, the manufacturers of CO2, as well as the end users. And we've begun going out there, beginning to educate policymakers on the really important role that CO2 has to do in food and beverage, infrastructure, welding, medical applications, that those are really important uses of CO2, and we can't ban CO2 outright. We need to control industrial emissions, but we need to make sure that there's a continued reliable supply of CO2 for these really important applications. So that's really where CGA has been focused on 2023, and in 2024, we're really going to ramp up that activity as well.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, I add one piece to that. From my perspective, I think it's not just about, we have to be aware of the existing utilization of CO2, which is critical. But I like to say that we need innovation and investment in future utilization of it. We can't just keep capturing it and putting it underground with no solutions to say, okay, how are we going to limit it, minimize it? We're never getting rid of fossil fuels and other aspects that generate CO2. We live, we breathe, CO2 exists. Can we find new uses of it? And I think that's another part on the legislation. Like, let's encourage that as much as we're encouraging sequestration, is where my take is.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Rob, what are you seeing out there? You're definitely way more global than we are. You guys, touch every corner of the earth on these issues, and I know it's not just the U.S. that we're seeing this.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting observation that the first 10 or 12 years that I've been reporting on this industry, it's been the invisible industry. And now we're really seeing that change in the last couple of years. And obviously the great work that Rich and the CGA and many of the other associations are doing, we're seeing that a very visible industry now. And if you look at the time of year we're recording as well, it's nearly Christmas. What a great time of year. We used to run a feature every year that profiled all the ways that CO2 would be used at Christmas and the festive season that you would never even think about. From the cold chain and getting that food essentially from farm to fork on Christmas Day, to, I don't know, the dry ice in the theatre production you might go and see on New Year's Eve, or there's all these different applications, and I think they've gone under the radar for so long. So it's great to see them now coming to the forefront, and not just during a CO2 crisis where people are worried about where the next pint's coming from, So
exactly.
I think that's been good to see, and I think obviously these problems have been mostly in North America and Europe. That's where the biggest CO2 crises have been, but we do see perceptions changing around the world, and I think that's the really important word, as you said, Jeff, perception. It's a little bit like with hydrogen. I'm sure we're all familiar with that too. We've got a perception change coming up of how we view CO2 and how we view hydrogen going forward, because we do need to see these gases, these commodities, through a different lens. They've got an incredibly important role to play across the whole industrial and sort of societal landscape. So I think, definitely game on in terms of changing those perceptions.
Rob makes a good point around the invisible industry, and I think here at CGA and our members, I think, have always we've prided ourselves that with the invisible industry. We kind of fly under the radar. We're self-regulated in many senses. The government, so to speak, is not trying to over-regulate us. But I think that's coming to hurt us. No one understands the role that our products play in society. You sit around and you hear people talk about global warming, and they're drinking their beer, how horrible global warming is. We got to stop global warming, get rid of CO2, and they have no idea that CO2 is used in that beer, or whatever the case might be. So we're really on a mission to educate around the role CO2 in this case, but of all the products we represent, helium, hydrogen, they're really important products to the world. And we need to move away being an invisible industry. And we now need to be an industry that's providing really a lot of value to society in general.
Well, and Rich, if we move too quickly, right, and we don't understand the full landscape, and we are incentivizing the wrong things, like is the opportunity there that we starve industry because of what we're doing with CO2? And Rob, maybe you have all experienced that in Europe. Some you tend to be kind of on that forefront of actually driving innovation for climate change. I think the U.S. lags there a little bit, but we also hear of shortages in Europe, I think, being more intense and obviously different sources of CO2. But is some of that self-inflicted?
Yeah, I think there's probably an element of that, and you're right. We suffer with it. Like you said, I think it's the intensity of the shortages, particularly in the UK, for example. We're so dependent on imported CO2 from wider Europe that actually, when we do have a shortage, it's a real crisis, and we saw that in 2018. I think September 21 we saw that, and then again a little bit last year as well. So yeah, I think there's potentially threats coming out of that as well, with perception and this fragile supply chain. You know, that we keep hearing this talk about substituting CO2 with other gases potentially. That I think there's a lot for the industry to look at and work on.
Yeah, that dovetails very interestingly because, I look at somewhere like Europe and see the reason that shortages in CO2 are so critical or so damaging is because you don't have much of a supply of CO2. Two of the major reasons are you don't do corn ethanol like we do here in the U.S., which is a major supply of our CO2, and you've all but banned ammonia production because of the CO2 emissions. But that ammonia is making the nitrates that are used for farming and better utilization and growth of farm production and basic general output of those things. But because you didn't want the CO2, you don't have those. Now you're importing CO2, and then we're going to sequester it. If we have better utilization of that CO2, and we talked about hydrogen, you take hydrogen and CO2 and some other mixes or other hydrocarbons, now you have sustainable aviation fuel. And so in a review of the year, just last month, we had our first transcontinental flight, 100% of sustainable aviation fuel. That's a great usage of green fuels and green energy that, now again, can we get back to the ammonia facilities and things like that? We have to be thinking forward, and that's where I think the year looking forward is, how do we look forward into usage of CO2 and stop thinking that CO2 is so bad? Like it isn't just about your next pint, right? It's our planes. We're making polymers with it and plastics and everything else that we can do with it. And because to Richard's point, there's not enough education out there, understanding of CO2. We just think CO2 is bad, and and go to COP, and they just said CO2 is bad. One of the biggest conversation pieces at COP was carbon capture, and that's just not the only solution. And I think that's important to note, and that's why it's so damaging when it does have the shortages here that we don't have to have, I guess is what I'm saying.
Luke, you asked the question whether we're shooting ourselves in the foot, and I don't know that it's that. I think it might be that we've been on the sidelines a bit too long. As an example, in the States, 35% or something like that of CO2 comes as an off gas from the production of ethanol, and ethanol is used in gasoline production. And so it's basically this waste gas that our members take. They take that waste gas, they clean it up, they liquefy it, and then they sell it into all these markets. The government, the U.S. government, as part of the Inflation Reduction Act, passed policies that call 45Q. And basically, companies are being incentivized to take CO2 and to sequester it, which means putting it in the ground so we can never get it out. They're going to be paid $85 a ton to sequester that CO2 because we want to clean the atmosphere from greenhouse gas, global warming gases. If you use that CO2 in applications like food production and beverages, you're going to get $60 a ton. So if you're an ethanol manufacturer out there and saying, okay, I can sell my product to the turkey industry or the meat industry, and I'm going to get a $60 tax credit. Well, that sounds pretty good. If I just put it in the ground, I'm going to get $85 a ton. That's a no-brainer for that company, right? They're going to put it in the ground. So it's policies like that we're kind of on the sidelines when these are being developed, and we need to be out there more often saying, hey, wait, before you do that, do you know that by incentivizing and putting it in the ground, you're going to be taking away from these critical applications? So the goal is to educate now so that future policies in North America and around the world are put in place as Jeff was saying, to use that CO2 in a more, useful way rather than just putting it in the ground, because these are really important applications. So I don't think we're shooting ourselves in the foot. I think we're not in the game, and now we're going to be in the game moving forward.
Well, and that said, maybe the pause on the pipelines comes at a critical time where, we had all these commitments to sequester CO2, and you would imagine that everybody committed, everybody signed up, still wants to leverage that credit. But as things slow down and we gain clarity on whether there's other opportunities to sequester or pipelines do come back online, in that intermediary period, Rich, you and team and everybody is out there, and we change that legislation and we create a new pipeline for use rather than for sequestration. I mean, maybe we did need this pause to get everybody on the same page.
Well, one of our critical asks, as we move down the path here, is going to be what we're calling parity, so that CO2 needs to be sequestered or utilized, and you should get $85 a ton if you put it in the ground. But use is just as important, so pay $85 a ton there. So that puts us on equal footing, so that we don't damage the markets that we have right now, and hopefully we'll be able to grow CO2 to be used, more CO2 to be used in these markets.
Yeah, that parity is important in my mind. Again, from the innovation standpoint, it's just like we need a 12-year bridge of sequestration to start capturing, build the pipelines, and basically enable investment. I think we need that same for the investment in innovation and utilization of it. And so, yeah, why should they get less? And there's pushback on it. Well, then you're still going to emit the CO2. Well, that CO2 is a whole lot cleaner than it was. It's 100% or 99% pure CO2 instead of having nitrous oxide and sulfide oxides and other dirty chemicals that are in there. So I think it's very important that we encourage the parity to bring that runway and make that available to investment for innovation in all of these other applications, and keep our existing infrastructure going. You shut a food processing plant down, or you shut a beverage bottling plant down, the millions of dollars a day of losses and price increases and things like that are extremely dramatic that people don't understand.
And Jeff, to your point, talking about just cleaning that CO2 up and where we get the CO2, in that process, we are stripping things that are a magnitude, several magnitudes, more devastating to the environment. We talk about global warming, right, Rich? And if that is truly the focus, if we are serious about that, then taking and cleaning up CO2 and putting it to use and incentivizing the investment around alternative use has benefits that do actually roll out today with some of the other greenhouse gases.
Yeah. One of the point on that issue is that we've done some calculations, and when you look at the amount of CO2 being used in the merchant market, these types of positive applications, compared to industrial emissions, and this is just in the States, the amount being used in this market is less than 0.25% of the CO2 of the industrial emissions. So it's minuscule. So we need to make sure that we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater as we try to solve the global warming issue, and we don't want to devastate these critical use markets over here.
Right. Well, hey, let's take this opportunity to transition and look forward. And we're going to lose Rob here. He's got a hard stop in a few minutes. But so let's look at 2024 and 2025. Maybe what are you seeing, Rob? Where are you seeing the market going from more specifically, obviously in North America, but globally? What's going to occur? Again, we talked about pipelines, we talked about distribution, we talked about legislation. What's your outlook for the next couple of years?
I think firstly, I'd come back to how you opened this in terms of 2023 wasn't a bad year, particularly for us guys. I mean, I've just been doing some analysis of our kind of top stories across the year at GasWorld. There wasn't a CO2 story in the top 10, which was quite telling. I mean, that's rare. The year's been dominated by helium and hydrogen topics for us, and a bit of spec gas. So that says that we had a less painful year. It also makes me think we've probably got some pain coming up in 2024. I mean, we seldom go for more than 12 months or so without a big blow up somewhere, some sort of crisis. So I'm immediately thinking that's coming up. But I'd probably look back at 2 or 3 points for me that resonated during our CO2 summit in Indianapolis. The first, we've covered already. Where you get your CO2 today will not be where you get it from tomorrow. The second is that pricing point that Rich has talked about. I mean, I've got my blue book of notes that I had on the ground in Indy, and I wrote down exactly what Rich was saying about that. And the third is for me, there's an overwhelming feeling or view on the ground that actually this is happening now. This change, this changing of the guard in CO2 supply and sourcing. There was very much a feeling in India, I felt, about get with the program. That this is happening. All of you need to switch on to that, and we need to all get into that sense of urgency. And I think it ties in with something Rich said in his talk, actually. Rich, I'm sure you quoted John F. Kennedy when you said of the CGA and the industry as a whole, if not us, then who? And if not now, then when? For me, it's just this urgency in the market. And I think in 2024, we're going to see so much more of that, so much more clarity on the sourcing landscape, on the pipelines, on everything we need. And one really big, exciting area, I think, is that waste to CO2. I think that circular economy approach, we see it with hydrogen as well. I think that's an exciting space. The fact that you could take that waste, convert it to CO2, and essentially do that kind of conversion where the sourcing and the demand is in the same place. I mean, that's fantastic. And you take transportation out of the loop slightly. I think there's a huge opportunity there to kind of clean up some crunch points in the supply chain. So I'm really excited about that in 2024 and beyond.
Yeah, that waste side, that biogas side, especially in Europe, I mean, really starting to advance it because we are already capturing the methane off of that waste. Not as much in the U.S. There's some, but certainly for Europe now, especially with the Nord pipelines going down over the last couple of years and trying to become energy independent from Russia and other parts of the world from natural gas. We're already doing it. The CO2 is there and it's clean. Let's do something with that CO2. And so that's already happening. So yeah, I think that's a great outlook. And I agree. We're starting to see movement and some transition on biogas here in the U.S. And the methane is certainly something we're already capturing and putting into pipelines, but it's very expensive. I mean, it's 10 times more the cost of just getting natural gas out of the ground. But that's got to come down. But in that, now there's CO2. Why don't we capture that CO2 and use it? It lowers the cost of that methane in itself and doing all that. So yeah, I totally agree with your outlook there.
And I
Rich,
think
how about
something
you?
Sorry,
no, please add on.
One final thing I was going to say, and I should have mentioned, I think we do have trouble ahead that we do need. We need to get through these waters. As we've said, one of our speakers in Indy described, I think, the period 1975 to 2000 as growth in CO2. In the industry, 2000 to 2020 maturity, and then he said 2020 to 2030 is going to be turmoil. That was his words. So we've got a lot to crack on with, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And you used the word blow up earlier for your stories, and I always like saying, we try to avoid those. Especially we don't really say that in CO2, but when it comes to hydrogen, we never say it's an explosive growth market. They don't go well together. Hydrogen does not explode. I mean, it
absolutely.
Does.
From CGA's perspective, as I look forward to 2024, Rob made a lot of good points about some factors that are out there, but probably the biggest challenge I think we have is the biggest challenge we have every year is we don't know what's going to happen with the supply of CO2 because CO2 today, we rely on, again, waste streams from other industrial applications, ethanol, ammonia, whatever the case might be. And there's factors that impact that. Whether they be really hot weather, which will suddenly increase the demand for it, whether it be things like one of the plants that we rely on goes down, whether the price of gasoline goes way up and so people stop driving, so they're making less ethanol. We don't control those factors. And so that will impact the availability of CO2, particularly as they get into the warmer months into the second half of the year. So going back to the CO2 solutions coalition, one of the goals that we're focused on making is a more reliable supply of CO2 for the longer term, so that every year when we start getting into the spring, these factors start happening and all the producers are scrambling to get their CO2. How can we ensure that there's a reliable supply of CO2 through some of these things like tax credits and things like that will begin to make policymakers appreciate CO2 and ensure that supply is there year in, year out?
Yeah, we like to term that security of supply, and we talk to our markets a lot about that. If you have a natural gas boiler or multiple on site of your facility and you're producing, power through that, well, it's also producing CO2. We can capture that and clean it up and then use that in your own process. So a lot of food processors at the early stages have that. So, you're producing CO2 and then you're buying CO2. So why don't we capture that, clean it up, and don't be so reliant on these variable sources that are also at risk of going offline with all of the things that we're talking about. Hydrogen generation. If you use steam methane reforming, you can generate. If you can use renewable energy to generate steam methane reforming hydrogen, you also get CO2. Now you can capture that CO2 and use that, make dry ice, use that in your application. That gets us off of these other generators of CO2, so we can work on decarbonizing those industries while capturing the additional CO2 that we're doing in some of these harder to abate industries or harder to abate locations like power generation and things like that. So I agree with both of you. It's slow and it's coming. But as more of these go offline, it's going to dictate that more of these things have to happen. But at the same time, if there's enough incentive to do it, we'll learn from it, and then it'll become cost effective, and economies of scale getting brought into play. So we have to see more of that. I think we're slowly getting there. Obviously, the media and outlet coverage from gasworld helps that tremendously. We've got to get that out to more end users. And Rich, the CGA, obviously industry wide, huge, but also the coalition and doing all those lobbying efforts at the legislative effort is huge, and bringing more users of CO2 to better understand where their CO2 is coming from is critical.
And the reality is, none of this happens overnight. Rob, as you mentioned, 2030, and that's looming. I mean, that is fast approaching. We act when there are shortages as if we don't know where to get the CO2. Jeff just laid out several sources. Rich laid out several sources. We do know where to get the CO2 from, and we just need to start being proactive, because at some point things won't reset. It has been cyclical. But yes, Rob, I think you set the stage well. A little bit of doom and gloom, but we can solve for those problems of tomorrow today. We just need to all be aligned and make sure that we understand it is not a flip of the switch to go from the purchasing of CO2, Jeff, to being self-reliant. Those things have to start happening soon.
Yeah, well, I always like to say, innovation is incremental, not monumental. But the problem is the legislation thinks it's monumental, right? And I think that's, Rich, what you're saying. That's why we have to get way more involved, because you can't just go, even like hydrogen is a good example of that right now. They're saying the only way you can produce hydrogen is with brand new electrolysis equipment of 100% only renewable energy from solar or wind. That's great. It's a great target. You can't go from here to here overnight. That's going to take a decade. We don't have enough renewable energy to do that. But if you put that legislation in place, you kill all innovation of hydrogen economy, and the hydrogen will just never happen if you have that. CO2 is the same way. Saying that you can't have this parity, saying that we're not going to incentivize, we just want to capture it and sequester it, and that's it. We're only going to focus on that. It's extremely short-sighted, but it's also negative. It's damaging, and then so that's why they've got to be educated on these, and we have to understand that these things take time, and it's not monumental. There's going to be incremental changes, and it might not be perfect today, as long as there's a pathway to get to perfect in a decade or two.
And Luke, I agree with your comment. I do have a positive outlook, because through this coalition, we're bringing some major players in Washington together. If I could just run through a few of them, we've got, the North American Meat Institute, the American Beverage Association, Coca-Cola, the Beer Institute, the National Turkey Federation, the Brewers Association, the GATA. We've got all the National Pork Producers Council. All these organizations have come together to help, to use their resources and their thousands of members to get this word out about how important this industry, the CO2 industry, is. So I feel confident that using all of these resources, we will have an impact. But to your point, Luke, it's going to take a little time, but I think we've got the right people on the team.
Oh, that's
I
great.
like that.
And maybe we wrap with saying, and maybe you have some closing thoughts, but we, Jeff and myself, right, we're so thankful for the voice that you both bring, because it helps amplify the message that we all feel. That's so important, and we want to have more people speaking out and bringing awareness and touching their audiences and having people ask those questions that maybe they are not thinking about. Sit there at Christmas this year, sit there over the holidays and have your beer and talk about what you're talking about, but understand where that CO2 comes from. And so this is just such a great platform, having time today to hear what the perspectives you all have coming from different parts of the world, and understand that there is alignment there and a path forward.
Absolutely.
Yep, absolutely.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so Rob, close this out, and so from general audience perspective, like if you are an industry or you are a major player and user of CO2, please connect with Rich and the CGA and the coalition to get involved, because the bigger the audience, the bigger the voice, the broader the audience that we reach at the legislative level. But and I encourage everybody to subscribe to Gasworld magazine, not just industrial gas distributors and producers, because there's so much valuable information on all gases that impact industries that you might not even realize impact you. And there's the great stories. They don't write stories and do things just on gas. It's about the applications and the downstream of it. So highly encourage that. But Rob, I know you've got to run as well. So please close us out. Any final thoughts on what you see for 2024?
I think exactly what you said. It's alignment. We've got this. We've got this as an industry. We've got this as a society. And I really urge anyone listening, any end users, anyone in government. I don't know who you've got listening, but if anyone picks this up, please come to us, come to Rich, come to you guys, and educate on CO2, because there's a lot more we could be doing with a circular economy approach in 2024 and beyond.
I think that sums it up. Excellent. Well, gentlemen, we really appreciate you coming on and give us feedback on where we were going into the year and where we're going into the future.
Right. Thank you, Jim. Thank you.
Thanks, team. Everyone take care.